For many people, their driver's license is not just permission to drive a car, it's freedom. That's especially true for the generations now heading towards their golden years. And that makes the question of seniors and road safety a pressing concern. Brenda Vrkljan is lead researcher for Candrive and an associate professor of occupational therapy at McMaster University. And she joins us now for more. Brenda, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited for you to be here. How did you become interested in seniors and driving?
Yeah, so I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I went to work in Chatham, Ontario, which is a smaller town in the southwestern corridor of Ontario. And it was while I was working at the hospital as an occupational therapist, and my training is really about helping people get back to the things that are important to them when they've experienced a health-related change that's brought them into the hospital. And so when I would ask people what it is you want to get back to doing, because when you're able to do the things that occupy your time, you have meaning and purpose. And so obviously we want to help people get back to those things. And so I would ask them, what's your goal once you get out of the hospital? What is it that you want to return to? And so driving came up over and over again. I mean, of course, returning home, back to their home, to where they live, was really important. But driving was a really big issue for people. And so being trained as in evidence-based practice, I went to the literature, and there were just major gaps in the area in terms of how I could test people, whether I could determine, based in the hospital room or in the outpatient setting, whether I could determine whether they were safe to drive or not. And so that's when I decided to return to school to try to fill that evidence gap. And concurrently across the province, it seems that I wasn't the only one asking those kind of questions. And there were two physicians in Ottawa who are the lead of Candrive, which is a research program that I'm a part of here in Canada.
And what are some of the things that you found?
Yeah, so Candrive is the Canadian Association, or sorry, not Canadian Association, it's the Canadian Driving Research Initiative for Vehicular Safety in the Elderly. So a very long name for a very important group, so we call ourselves Candrive. And what it is an interdisciplinary team that's come together with leading researchers, clinicians, as well as senior groups to work together on the issue. And so we came together probably about 15 years ago, so while I was doing my PhD. And what we did was we applied for funding, and we were able to get funding from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. And so what we did was designed a study called a prospective cohort study, which means that we've tracked people for the past 5 years, older adults, age 70 and older, in 3 main areas.
What are those areas?
Yeah, so the first area is their health, not surprisingly. So we bring in our participants who had to be age 70 and older, because what we see at age 70 in the statistics in terms of at-fault collisions, we see a rise in people's risk of crash. And so we see that also in the lower age groups, so that 18 to 25, it's essentially a U-shaped curve.
Right.
And so at age 70, why are those crashes happening?
Is it age, or is it medical conditions?
Yeah, and so we wanted to find out, right, in terms of, and so to be able to follow people. So we had healthy people enroll in the study, and we were able to track them on 3 main things. So I said the health part, and then we also tracked their driving patterns using GPS technology. The third part was the crashes. Our participants were so giving in terms of being able to track when they were in a crash, their license, their records, in terms of if they were in a crash, we were able to know that through the ministry records that have been shared with us.
Okay, so we're looking up at an image right now. Can you tell me what we're looking at, please?
Yeah, so that's, we had 7 sites across Canada, so over 900 Canadians, older Canadians, age 70 and older, enrolled. And so using Google Maps and a GPS device that was put in their car, you can see that that's images from all 7 of our sites. We had a site in Victoria, that's the one on the West Coast. We had a site in Thunder Bay, Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, where I'm the lead investigator, and Montreal, as well as Winnipeg.
And the second image that we're looking at, what is this?
So what we're able to do, this is my Hamilton participants, and we're able to drill down using the GPS technology to look at where they're driving. And so what people say they do, Nim, versus what they actually do doesn't always match. And it's the same in driving. So what we're able to do is track every trip our participants made in their vehicle. So when they were driving, if there was bad weather, were they out on the roadways? Were they driving at night? Because we know that seniors don't always, or they do talk about, oh, I restrict myself in terms of they're very safe, they're very experienced.
So they won't drive like during rush hour or anything like that?
Yeah, and that's what we hear. But what we're able to do is actually see for the first time that when they are actually driving. And this is a representative group of older Canadians, because we also did a comparison with some Stats Canada data that was collected to look at whether our sample was representative of older Canadians who are aging in place.
And we have a last image to show. What are we looking at here?
So that's Hamilton itself, and so what we're able to do, so again, going further, we can go right down to an individual trip as well, and you can see the hot spots in terms of where people are driving. And so what that tells us is that people are driving on all kinds of roadways. They're driving on the 401 series highways, and we can also know what the weather was like when they were driving, and their choices, and even the places that they were going. Because ultimately, when I go back to my experience in Chatham, driving is not just about, it's about getting from A to B, but it's what's at B that's really critical, right?
I was going to ask that. How important is driving? I mean, I think we take it for granted that we can just get into a car and go where we want to go, but how crucial is it for seniors?
I mean, what I heard in the hospital through to our participants, I mean, when we put out a call for our study, we weren't sure whether people would respond, because it really is a sensitive issue. It's so important to people to be able to continue driving, that for people to give themselves in terms of their health, their driving patterns, to be followed in that way is you know, something they're very giving in terms of being able to do that. So I think for seniors, it's the freedom, it's the convenience. And so people aren't going, and some people are going to Florida, but it's really going to the grocery store, it's going to see family and friends, and it's so that connection with others, the social isolation that we're always concerned about, Nam, because that has detrimental effects.
Depression being one of the things, right?
Yes, yes.
We have a video that your students prepared featuring a senior driver, and he's talking about what driving means to him. Let's take a look.
My love for cars started at a very early age. And my first car was a 1960 Ford Falcon. That car represented independence, and it represented freedom to me. And it meant everything. Now that I'm older, the car is just as important to me. I rely on it for everything. For getting groceries, going to doctor's appointments, running my grandchildren around. I need a car, and I hope I can drive as long as I can.
What is your response to the video? What he just said?
When we put it together with the senior, so his name is Larry, we only asked him to speak about the importance of the car to him, and we didn't script what he said, and so he just spoke in terms of his relationship with his automobile. And so when we're working with our study participants, and we're just in the middle of a study right now to look at older adults who drive the most advanced automobiles on the marketplace, so the ones with the fancy gadgets. Again, they speak to that, the importance of driving to them in terms of the freedom it gives them to be able to do the things that are important to them, the things that occupy their time.
Why not just use public transit?
That's you know, when I'm talking about my research, I often, people often ask, well, just get people off the roadway, right? And unfortunately, public transit, if I go back again to my experience in Chatham or in small town Ontario, I was in Fenelon Falls the other weekend. For people to be able to get to the places that are important to them, public transit doesn't do it. It's not convenient. So you can imagine having to walk from your home to a bus shelter, having to stand and wait for a bus, as an example, one example of public transit. And that really puts people at risk, right? In terms of falls, which is another major concern. And there has been some studies done in Scandinavia around that you actually see pedestrian fatalities, which we know is a concern here in Toronto and other parts of Canada and other major cities. So we just need to really think about the whole system.
I mean, I come from London, Ontario, and sometimes the bus would only come once an hour.
That's right. So it's not the same as walking outside of your door. And in fact, when you're in a vehicle, you're quite protected. So if something is to happen, there is a shell around you. But when older drivers are in a collision, that's a major concern because they already are more at risk because of the frailty. Some of the things that happen to our bones, our skin, our structures, that puts them at risk in terms of injury. And so we want to reduce the number of crashes, but it really takes a system approach. And so I appreciate that you've brought up public transit. I think it's a really important thing that we need to think about given the aging population.
I want to go to another video that your students put together, and this time it's with the streeters giving their views on senior drivers. Let's take a look.
There's a lot of issues with seniors.
They drive slowly or brake too much.
Seniors lost their edge, I guess you could say, when they're driving.
Well, yeah, they should be taken off the road, to be honest with you.
I just don't feel like they are aware of their surroundings as much as the average driver should be.
How true is a sentiment being expressed in the streeters? By the streeters?
If I base it on, so if I walk out on the street today and I say that I've been to TVO and the topic that was discussed, the first thing I often hear is, oh, that people tell a story about their experience of seeing their neighbor who may not be safe on the road, or that, you know, get those older drivers off the road. And my reaction to that, having seen how important and heard from Canadians working as an occupational therapist, how important it is for people to be able to do those things. I just try to say to people that you could actually lose your license at any point along the lifespan based on if something medical has happened to you. And think about the impact that might have on your life and your ability to do things. So I try to get people to think about, put themselves in the other person's shoes. And I think that transcends beyond just driving, but to be able to really understand the impact it could have on your life, you have to sometimes think about the concern.
And I think we also forget that sooner or later, we're all going to probably be in that situation.
Yes.
Because we're all getting older.
Yes, and in fact, the statistics show, I mean, we are living longer, so we know the average age of a Canadian is up to 81, women being 84, men being 80, which is amazing in terms of the medical advancements.
Is there a difference between men and women?
Yeah, so women live to 84 and men live to 80, typically in terms of the average. But what we know is people will outlive their driving ability. So typically 10 years for men and 7 years for women. I may have those reversed, but the important point is that people will outlive their driving ability. So then it does come down to what options, what mobility options can we have? Because if people aren't able to get to the places that are important to them, to be able to participate in society, to be with others, it's really a mobility issue. So driving's a privilege and mobility is a right. And so we need to really think about the implications.
What are some of the options that we have then?
Oh boy, so I think as an occupational therapist and sitting down with an older client or with any client is to really think about how their lives work in terms of how they structure their day. So where are they going, how often, how are they getting there currently? And it may be that they're already relying on family and friends in terms of a shared economy in some ways is one of the new terms we hear, and that's transferring to driving as well. So seniors drive seniors, we know that. So I think in terms of people's ability to get around when they've lost their license is quite challenging, particularly in rural Canada. So Chatham is a metropolis in some ways, but it feeds Wheatley, it feeds Tilbury. And how do the people in Tilbury get to, you know, the major stores, the grocery stores that are in Chatham?
I wanted to ask you, how do senior drivers compare to younger drivers, like teenagers?
So overall, when we look at crashes across the lifespan, younger drivers are still a major concern. So, so they really, and there are lots of resources being poured into that area in terms of research, and you know, we have graduated licensing, which has made a big difference in terms of people getting the skills. But when we look at distance driven, crashes per distance driven, and at-fault crashes in particular, we see that seniors are very similar to the youngest drivers in terms of their crash rates. With older drivers, they're more likely to be in multi-vehicle collisions, unfortunately. Crashes are more likely to occur in daylight hours and at intersections.
And I guess the idea is that for younger drivers, they will become better, and I guess older drivers, they will probably become worse drivers?
Well, I think from some of the research that we've done at McMaster, so in addition, I talked about those 3 parts of the Candrive study, and in fact, we got additional funding from another research network here in Canada called Auto 21, and we were able to put cameras in our participants' vehicles and had them drive to the places that they normally go, so the grocery store within a 30-minute radius of their house. And then we analyzed in terms of their health to look at maybe are there any relationships between some of the maneuvers we saw or their abilities behind the wheel and their health. And what we realized is that our sample was relatively healthy overall, but we still saw some bad habits, Nam, in terms of people not stopping properly. And I think we all have those kind of bad habits. And I think for a senior, if they make an error though, for them to be able to compensate quickly and react quickly, that's where the age-related changes have implications. So we saw our seniors were speeding because we can track their driving speed as well. They were keeping up with the flow of traffic. But again, if they're involved in a collision under those circumstances, they're more at risk. So going back to the question, I think when we have bad habits, I'm really interested in how refresher courses could help a senior who may be exhibiting some bad habits to go out with a driving instructor. I think as an occupational therapist to keep up your skills in that way is really important. So, so I think much of the time we'll go, work on our golf swing, and I think we need to think about that in terms of driving.
So for all of us, like every few years, get a refresher course.
Yes, and there's concerns here in the province around age-based testing, and there's been some controversy, right, around the policies that are in place, and that age 80, you have to go for a mandatory education session, they call it, as part of the senior driver renewal program. And I think re-educating and getting up to speed is really important, right? So so for younger drivers, they have the ability as well to improve, and so I think people can improve at any age. And it's just if it starts to become medical, that's where you want to make sure that
everyone's safe.
Everyone's safe, exactly.
When it comes to taking seniors off the road, who makes that call?
So there's a misconception. So in terms of the doctor or the physician. So here in Ontario, it is mandatory for a physician, if they're concerned about anybody over the age of 16 who has a driver's license, who may pose a risk, they need to speak or report that person to the licensing body. And the concern there is for physicians as well as myself as an occupational therapist and other healthcare professionals is what are the tools that we can use to try to make that determination? And so we have policies around that because we know at age 80, yes, there's that kind of population level testing or screening, but it's really, we know that medical conditions can happen at any age. So the physician is the closest, the closest person's ally. So people are often angry at their physician, but in actual fact, it's the ministry that's making that decision behind the scenes. Seniors are able to appeal the process, or anybody's able to appeal the process if their license has been taken away. There's a medical advisory team, and I work very closely with the Ministry of Transportation. They're our partners on the Candrive project, and I know they're working really hard to make sure that we keep people safe and mobile on the roads for as long as possible.
Is it expensive to do all that testing? Or retesting?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the cost, Nam, to be perfectly honest, but I think there's a cost when somebody loses a life. There's a cost if there's a crash to a senior and there's they're in the hospital. And in fact, we know when people lose their license, and whether it's voluntary or otherwise, they actually end up in nursing care or long-term care sooner. And the evidence shows that. So we want to keep people mobile. And if they're not driving, then we need to make sure that there's other avenues.
And how effective are driving tests at determining whether a senior is still capable of driving?
So we have invested, and I say we because the taxpayers have invested quite a bit of money in terms of the Candrive study, but it's really important. So the Candrive study has not only this cohort study where we've tracked older Canadians, but there's been a lot of other investigation in terms of the types of vehicles older Canadians are driving, because we need to think about the types of roads that people are driving on.
There's a test that's done. What's the clock drawing test?
We're working with our Candrive team to develop a tool. So as you'll recall, when I was working as an occupational therapist, I wasn't sure which tool I could use to be able to determine whether somebody was at risk, just to screen and then send them on for further evaluation. So we've looked at all kinds of tests, and one of them being the clock drawing test, which is actually used as part of that 80 and older program as a screening mechanism. We can't use just one tool, NAM, to be able to make a determination of whether somebody's safe to drive, but the clock drawing does.
We have an example of it. We have an example of it on the screen. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is taken from an article or a blog that I wrote that was put on the McMaster Optimal Aging portal. But here I talked about how you can see changes in terms of people's ability to perceive information and so we give them instructions, and the instructions are standardized, and we ask people to draw a clock and put, in this case, we're asking them to put the time 10 after 11. What you don't see here, and what we see in our outpatient settings and inpatient settings, is the person actually, how they go about drawing the clock, which also gives you information, right? When you observe somebody.
What kind of information does it give you?
How they are planning, their motor planning, are they thinking aloud or speaking aloud when they're trying to do it? Are they expressing difficulty, or are they doing it very quickly and just, and that's all information, subjective information, including, there's also a scoring method. There's different ways to score the clock, but there's a lot of information that can be gained from just watching somebody complete some of these tests, not just clock drawing, but any cognitive or test of thinking skills.
And I'm guessing it depends on, how you draw the clock, how you would respond on the road if something happened, right?
Yeah, so we've looked at the evidence. So, I mean, the hard part is for somebody to understand that, drawing a clock seems so different from our abilities on the road. And so being able to translate that information to somebody to say, look, the way we perceive information in our environment. So let's take an intersection, for example. We've done a better job in terms of having advanced screens and turn signals, but intersections, when you're making a left-hand turn, are very busy places. Pedestrians, lots of information that needs to be processed. So if you're having a hard time following instructions, being able to put things, and you saw in that picture that some of the numbers were askew, visual perceptual skills were off, you can imagine that behind the wheel, people might have a hard time processing information and reacting to it appropriately on the road.
I know we touched a little bit on this earlier, but how do you balance the safety of other drivers with the desire to keep seniors mobile?
I think that is the crux of, it's almost an ethical dilemma in some ways, because of the implications we know that can happen when somebody's license is taken away, NAM. And that's what drove me, for lack of a better analogy, back to school to do my PhD, because I saw it was just so important. So I want to make sure, because the tool that I use as an occupational therapist, as soon as we start having that conversation, it's immediate stress for people. So one of the key things is to get people to plan ahead, to prepare for driving cessation before they start to have some of these implications.
And where does the government come in? Like, how much coordination is there with the government and policymakers on this issue?
They are right at the table with us, and that's where the Candrive study has been so good, to bring key stakeholders together, seniors themselves, policymakers, to make sure that we base the decisions on evidence and not age. So what we constantly say is this is about function. We know a person at age 80, they can look very different from each other in terms of their abilities. And so we want to make sure that we're treating people as individuals.
And fairly.
And fairly. That's really important. So the risk stratification tool, which means that we're trying to, the tool that we're developing with Candrive, so I would have that, and clock drawing may be part of that test. It'd probably include multiple tests, because, as I said, one test. We don't want to make a determination of driving based on one test. So we want to make sure that the issue is approached sensitively, and that if there are concerns, that we are talking about that person in terms of their mobility options. Unfortunately, when you think of something like a stroke, that happens suddenly, right? And so people, and we've seen, younger and younger people, unfortunately, having strokes. And so that can happen suddenly. With dementia, it's kind of a gradual, progressive neurological decline. And we know, though, that, again, the evidence tells us that people at those early stages of dementia can still drive safely, but we want to make sure we monitor them. And that's where the government is an important player, right, in terms of that ongoing monitoring, because people need to renew their license, NAM, and so we want to make sure that we're all working together on this important issue.
What about car companies? Are they doing anything about this, or?
Yep. So, when we look at the whole picture in terms of the person, the driving environment, and the demands of being able to drive safely, so the occupation of driving, we would put all those things together. We often focus on the individual and the changes that are happening at the individual, and I think we need to really think about the environment in terms of the way vehicles are designed. So that person-vehicle fit is what I refer to it as. And so I'm working with my students right now, in fact, on some of, to look at that issue. So we're even looking at how people get into and out of the car as older adults, because there's a lot of falls. The evidence shows that there's falls in that context. So even where people are putting their hands to make sure that they're able to get in there safely. The other thing is, I have another student that took when we track the people by using those cameras, looking at how people's hands are placed on the wheel, what are they doing while they're driving on those short trips in terms of their how they're sitting biomechanically, for lack of a better word, at the wheel. And we're just starting to investigate that too, because we actually don't know when people are in their car, how are they driving? And so this is really exciting to be able to use some of the technology that's emerged to track people within their car, in their own neighborhoods, going to the places that are important to them.
We only have 30 seconds left, but I wanted to get your insight on this. What do you think of Uber and driverless cars? How would they change this conversation?
Oh my goodness. So that's another issue that people bring up. Oh, actually, you won't have a program of research necessarily because people are going to have driverless cars, but it's going to be a real adaptation for our society. And so when you think about you and I even, we've seen major changes in the automobile. What I refer to the vehicle cockpit now, because there's just so many dials and different gadgets. And so we are looking at, as I said earlier, at older drivers who have the most advanced cars in terms of technology, to see how that's having implications on their habits and how that might be influencing the way they drive.
Brenda, thank you so much for being here. Like I said before, if it's not affecting us now, it will one day. So we should all be paying attention to this.
I really appreciate having this conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.